there's no better way to start off the day with our first guest speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Economy. I don't think Liz needs an introduction, but I'm still trying to do my job here. So let me still show you. So Liz is formally is the Hargrove Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's also co-chaired a very excellent program on U.S. China and the world. He got PhD from Michigan. He has taught in many places like Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and University of Washington. Of course, he's the author of many influential award-winning books, including the most recent one, The World According to China. So I don't want to waste the time. So we are so lucky to have you as a colleague and partner at Sky. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Economy. So I have about we have about 45 minutes. Okay. So I think I'm going to take about half of the time, leaving the other half to the audience to ask your questions. Okay. Let's start with one of the most important questions. Like, what do you think is the most? Of course, there are multiple objectives of U.S. policy toward China. It could be like stop China from growing, coexist with China, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. So what do you think is the most important objective of U.S. policies towards China?
Yeah. Thank you, Hongbin, and thank you, Scott and Matt, for inviting me here. It's really terrific to be part of this and to look out and see so many incredible experts on China in this room. So really looking forward to the discussion and hearing your comments and questions as well. So if you will indulge me, I'll just take maybe 1 or 2 minutes to give a little bit of, I think, historical lead up to the moment we're at, because I think it's difficult to really understand what the Trump administration seems to be trying to do. And like Scott, I often feel like I'm saying, here's what I think is happening, and then something else entirely happens. Although I try for that not to happen too often, but sometimes it does. Because I think it's hard to understand if you don't have a little bit of context. So, thinking back to, and I won't spend a long time on this, but thinking back to the 1970s when we opened the relationship and we normalized the relationship, and we had this policy overall of engagement, which essentially said we wanted to help bring China into the international system, into the system of institutions and norms, and we believed that China would, in the words of Deputy Secretary of State Bob Zoellick, become a responsible stakeholder. That was the objective. And we also believed, and this has been tracked by many people, many secretaries of state, national security advisors, and even presidents have spoken about how they also believed that the rise of China's middle class would produce not only greater market forces, but also demands by the middle class for a greater say in their own political system and how they would be governed. So essentially a form of modernization theory. And I think this really held through most of the Obama administration. And so our policy was directed toward that. There were conflicts, but the conflict in many respects was largely limited, I would say, to trade, Taiwan, and human rights. We really had these 3 issues that, to a greater or lesser extent would burble up and cause friction in the relationship. But they primarily, that's what you saw, I think, through most of the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. I think the overall sense began to shift in the latter half of the Obama administration. You had the pivot, the rebalance to Asia, which in essence said, I think, moved us from a strategy of engage but hedge to a strategy of hedge but engage. So there was a sense that maybe with China's increasing assertiveness, for example, in the South China Sea, that China maybe wasn't going to move in exactly the right direction, at least from our own perspective. Then I think when you hit the Trump administration, I think the policy really shifted to something more akin to compete, counter, and to contain. And that's where you had the statement that China was our sort of pacing challenge, our most significant long-term strategic challenge. I think the Trump administration really shifted the discourse in the United States almost 180 degrees. And you saw by the end of the administration that we had no dialogues going on between the United States and China. So, in my sort of the bigger context, I tend to think of it as having gone from a policy where we were focused, 90% on cooperation, 10% on conflict, to really 90% on conflict and 10% on cooperation. And then I think the Biden administration, in which I served, we ended up with managed competition. And I think for the first 2.5 years, really the focus was on the competition part. And it was on trying to ensure that the United States had the capabilities to compete effectively with China. And that meant investing at home through things like Chips and Science and the Inflation Reduction Act. It meant sort of modernizing our economic tools. And those included things like export controls, in and outbound investment screening, a whole new emphasis on supply chains, which really developed out of COVID, because it was the first time I think that we realized how great a dependence we could have on other countries, sort of this single source dependency for PPE, and that we were vulnerable in the sense for human security. And then that sort of expanded to things like semiconductors, which is not about China, but is about Taiwan, and sort of an overdependence there. We don't want to be so dependent on any one nation or country for something that is critical to our economic national security or our human security. So that was a new effort that came out of the Biden administration. And then I think, third, there was a big emphasis on reestablishing relations with our allies and partners, and engaging again back in the international system. Because one of the hallmarks, I think, of the first Trump administration was, pulling out, of course, from a number of international agreements and institutions, the UN Human Rights Commission, Council, the Paris Climate Accords, the threat to pull out of the World Health Organization, the Iran nuclear deal, and of course, sort of maligning our allies. Mostly in Europe, actually during the Trump administration, the relationship with our Asian partners continued and to some extent was even bolstered. You had much, stronger relations with the Quad countries, for example, and the U.S.-India relationship really became stronger in the Trump administration. But in any case, so the Biden administration was much about working with allies and partners. It also had a very strong democracy component. And so President Biden liked to talk about democracies versus autocracies. And I think, there were, 3 democracy summits that the U.S. held over the course of the Biden administration. So the frame for the China relationship, at least again for the first 2.5 years, was about competition. We also did not have channels of communication underway aside from Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan with their counterparts Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. But in the latter year and a half, I think the Biden administration came to appreciate that you really ran a significant risk of, miscalculation, miscommunication when you're not talking. And so you had in short order over the summer of 2023, not only Tony Blinken, but you had Janet Yellen, you had my boss, Secretary Raimondo, going to China, Secretary Kerry. That was actually one channel, I should have qualified that. One channel that did maintain over the course of the Biden administration was the climate change channel, because Secretary Kerry had a personal relationship with his counterpart, Xie Zhenhua, and felt very strongly that this should be ongoing no matter what the overall relationship was. Okay, now, and this is a long lead up, but the Trump administration today. So I think it's a little bit hard to tell where things are going to land ultimately, but my overall assessment is that we are in a continued place of significant economic and security competition, but we have fundamentally dropped the sort of human rights and democracy component. I mean, of course, we're under assault. Our own democracy is under assault. So we've also, of course, moved back to the previous Trump administration policy of pulling ourselves out of international institutions. And we've, also the relationship with Europe is quite strained. But here again, the relationship with our Asian partners is not as challenged as it is with our European partners. And part of that may stem, I think there could be a number of reasons, but part of it may stem from the fact that Asia is more critical, I think, in the administration's assessment in the strategic competition, in the military competition with China. Asia is central. And so, to the extent that we're thinking about President Trump and the early talk in the administration of spheres of influence, and there was sort of sense, is it going to be China and Asia, Russia, Europe, the United States, and the North and South America? I don't think that is actually where this is going. I think it is, of course, the U.S. and North and South America, but I also think the U.S. sees itself very much continuing to be a Pacific power and trying to maintain, a degree of very deep engagement in that region in competition with China. So I think the economic competition, the security competition will continue to be intense. I think the democracy, human rights, efforts to bring China into international institutions, all of that essentially will have dropped off almost entirely.
Wow. So,
okay, I know that was a long lead up, but I just think it's useful to have a context for how American policy has shifted and evolved over time, and that this is, fundamentally different from what has come before, but not so fundamentally different from the first Trump administration.
Right. So I think you talk about so many important things. So one question I also have actually, do the Trump and Biden and do both parties agree the past policy of engagement has failed?
So, do the parties agree?
The policy mans.
To policy. So I'm not someone who believes that engagement failed. So it's a little bit difficult for me to separate that out. So I think engagement actually succeeded in some very fundamental ways. I worked on the environment for a lot of my career, China and the environment, and when I look to see how the United States and China in the 1990s, for example, engaged on the environment not only at the government-to-government level in terms of capacity building and training and sharing of laws and enabling China to develop a legal infrastructure, but also through NGOs. We did, amazing work with Chinese NGO leaders in the mid-1990s who came to the United States and would spend time, 3 months or 6 months being based in U.S. NGOs like NRDC or Environmental Defense Fund, learning about how to organize, how to raise money, do all these things, and would go back. And I think China's environmental landscape has been transformed, not because of that, but in part. The United States, Japan also played a really important role in helping develop capacity in China. So I think engagement, and there are, I think, many other areas also where engagement has resulted in helping China transform in some very positive ways. So I don't ever say engagement failed. I think it's a ridiculous statement. However, did engagement realize the ultimate objective that I sort of set out at the beginning in terms of, making China a responsible stakeholder and, certainly opening up China politically? Not. Right? Certainly China's a responsible stakeholder in some areas, not in others, and obviously in the political realm, we have not seen the blossoming of what most people would consider to be democracy.
Right. So you list many policy objectives of the past 30 years, right? What do you think? The most effective policies or the way of dealing with China? What have failed? What need to be reassessed?
So I think
can you give some examples?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say what's worked and what's not without thinking about what's going on in China at the time. Right. Because at the same time as the U.S. has its policies toward China, China itself has evolved significantly over time. And so policies that once worked in China, for example, what I just mentioned, right? Sort of that NGO to NGO collaboration. Before 2017, the U.S., there were, not the U.S., but there were over 7,000 non-governmental organizations in China, international non-governmental organizations working in China on issues like the environment or poverty alleviation, public health. I think we're having a profound impact. Then you have that passage of the law in 2017, basically sort of management of foreign NGOs, and it dropped to, under 500 today. So clearly that kind of engagement is no longer that relevant, right? It's not going to have the same impact. So it's hard to say without looking at certain periods what policies have worked and what policies haven't. And welcoming China into, for the purpose of this discussion, welcoming China into the World Trade Organization. People today, of course, to your earlier question, a lot of policymakers in the United States say that was a huge mistake, right? We shouldn't have done that. China upended it. We've suffered because of it. Again, I think that's too simplistic a formulation. I think clearly there are areas where it would be good if we could have, new approaches, new systems in place within the WTO that would hold China to account for certain practices in a more effective way. But I would never say that it was a mistake to let them in. And I think that was an effort, that engagement, the negotiations that brought China into the WTO, again, had a profound, important, and positive impact on the Chinese economy. And at the same time, as everybody in this room knows, helped enable, policymakers like Zhu Rongji to undertake the reforms that he wanted to undertake in China, right? Brought that kind of international pressure to bear and helped. So, again, at various points in time, I think certain policies have worked well, and they may not work well in the current context. They may not make sense in the current context. So if you give me a context, I can give you some better
For
answer.
example, like trade, right? So Trump started the first trade war in Trump 1, right? And then he raised some tariffs. Biden kept all the tariffs, right? They also raised other tariffs later on, right? Like tariffs on EVs. So is tariffs, really a great weapon to be used? As economists, we never understand why that country use tariffs, right? Especially two big countries. It doesn't make sense. But why is it so popular among policymakers?
So I think, tariffs can be used in a positive way, of course, in trade negotiations. You lower tariffs, right, to enable trade. That would be the positive way to use tariffs. The way the Trump administration has mostly used them, especially with China, and you're right, the Biden administration kept the tariffs on, has been as a mechanism to protect American industry, certain sectors of the American economy from what it deems generally to be unfair practices by China. Do I think that that's the best way to address for example, the Chinese export of overcapacity in EVs? No, I don't. I would far prefer that we work in concert with allies and partners to, develop new rules, new regimes that, China would, have to change its practices. And I think at this point in time, we're not even just talking about the US and Europe, we're talking about countries like Mexico and Brazil, Argentina and India that are all concerned about not just EVs and batteries, but, for example, all the made in China 2025 technologies that are going to follow this same pattern of, industrial policy in China and, overinvestment, overcapacity, and export of that overcapacity in ways that I think, have the potential to really prevent other countries from even developing those industries over time. They will be so swamped by Chinese goods, Chinese technology. So I think that the time, is ripe for a more coordinated action among concerned economies, but that's clearly not the way that the Trump administration is approaching this problem. And I'll be honest, when I was in the Biden administration, we did this 4-year tariff review, and we got, 1,496 comments from industry associations and companies, and it's open to the public. You can go and read them, talking about the tariffs. And companies would say, these tariffs are, harming us, or these tariffs actually do help us. And overall, because I read through them and I had an intern do an assessment of them, about 2/3 of the comments were that the tariffs were hurtful. And yet, we did nothing about that. To me, that's just the triumph of politics over policy analysis, right? Because you're basically, I think there was an overall concern. And Ramin, maybe you want to weigh in on this. He's sitting in the back there. He was at the State Department and worked on economic policy. I'd be interested to know whether you agree with me or not. But to me, that's, there was a fear that, you would be attacked. The administration would be attacked for being soft on China. And so at least that's my own assessment. And to me, that's a mistake. right? I would much rather have our policies be based in actual policy analysis. And if you're going to invite all these companies and trade associations to comment, you might as well actually listen to those comments and take action to address them. So, but I have zero faith that the Trump administration is going to look at those comments and do anything about them. And I think this whole 10% global tariff, and then it's clear that these things have no actual basis in economics and trade relationships. This is political gamesmanship, and I'd be shocked if actually 10% tariff is really going to, drive reindustrialization in the United States. Maybe it brings in some additional money. I don't know, but I don't think it's going to accomplish the bigger objectives, and certainly isn't going to change basic Chinese economic behavior.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned something. Actually, I recently saw a podcast by Tom Friedman. Mm-hmm. So in the podcast, he said, there's something interesting in Washington. Washington doesn't agree on almost anything except China. So it's very almost unanimous. Everyone agree on anything about China. So when this happens, so he worries that you cannot hear the other side of the voice. What if we are wrong?
Yeah. I do think that there is debate. I think where there is agreement is that China poses a significant economic, security, and political challenge to the United States. I would say you'll find very little disagreement between the two political parties on that assessment. But where, again, and what I tried to sort of demonstrate in my first set of comments, where there are differences and significant differences are in what you do about it, right? And how you respond to it. And so I think that's where there is still significant difference. And to be frank, there is still a caucus within Congress that is more moderate, but their voices are not so loud anymore. These are people like Rick Larson, for example, who, there was a kind of it was, up through the Obama administration, probably the most important group of, members of Congress. They had the loudest voice. Today, that's been completely drowned out by the House Select Committee, I think. And that probably does represent a greater degree of the consensus position within Congress. But still, again, you'll find differences of opinion probably around things like, should we welcome Chinese investment into the United States, and what kind of investment? Differences of opinion around, what constitutes, critical technologies, areas that need to be protected, through export controls. So I think on actual elements of policy, you will find differences of opinion. But again, on the broader sense of China as a strategic threat, I don't think you find much difference of opinion.
Yeah, actually, I just came back from Europe. So I talked to Europeans. So everyone talk about, the uncertainty of policies of the U.S.
Yes.
We have to talk about the current administration is different from the last one. Trump 2 is also different from Trump 1, right? In terms of his, the people advising him, right? So with such a dramatic policy changing from day to day, what do you think, other countries will, the allies, right? Yeah. How do they think about U.S. policy?
So, I don't think there are any allies that are excited by the, advent of Trump 2. I don't think there's anything to be excited about, and because it does induce a lot of uncertainty. It takes the United States off the stage as the provider of, sort of the most important provider, for example, of global assistance and aid. And because, the president believes that's a burden that the United States should not be bearing. I would argue we still play a significant role given all the foundations that we have that are still doing this kind of work. But in terms of U.S. government role, clearly that's, changed. Our position on climate change, something else our allies and partners are not going to be excited about. Just a general, I think, greater sense that the United States is withdrawing into itself. Obviously, the tariff policy, there's nothing for them to be happy about there. I will say, I think there's a little bit, again, of a difference between the way that some countries in Asia and in Europe are viewing and reacting to this. And I think in Asia, at least, I think there's a sense that, okay, we have seen this before, and we can manage through the next 4 years. Just need to, hold on tight, and we can get through it. I think in Europe, there's a much greater sense of alarm and existential threat. I do think what's interesting, and since we're talking about China, I think that the natural, or at least the first impulse, was to assume that China would just step into the breach. This is very much what people thought back in 2017 as well, that with the United States withdrawing, retreating from its role on the global stage, that, I should have mentioned Ukraine, of course, as a huge issue for the Europeans, and the on-off threats of withdrawal from NATO, which I don't think are, I don't think that's going to happen. But just the threat of it, right, of course, is anxiety-producing. But I think so again, the natural impulse was to say that China's going to fill the vacuum. That's not what happened in the first Trump administration. China didn't step up to lead on the global stage in a significant way. It wasn't forging new agreements, on methane emissions, for example. That happened later with the United States, and the United States led that in the Biden administration. So it didn't do that. I don't think it was prepared to do it. I think the ambition was there, but the actual capability and will to do it were not there. And then you had COVID, which was a complete disruptor. This time around, I think President Xi has articulated over the past 4 years a whole set of global initiatives. The Global Development Initiative, there was already the Belt and Road Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, all of which have within them a fairly transformative vision for the international system. And so I do think that there is a sense in China, among some anyway, that this is a moment that China can take advantage of, right? And what does that look like? Well, I mean, China's been calling for the end of the U.S.-led alliance system. Is that something the Trump administration is going to do? Again, they've talked about it. I don't think it's going to happen, but there might be some sense that this is another opening. There's the, role of the United States pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council. Again, that's something China has a very different vision for what human rights should look like, state-directed human rights. Every state should decide for itself what human rights it has, as opposed to universal human rights. So does that offer an opportunity for China? And obviously, China's been pitching itself as the global stabilizer in the trade and investment realm. Having said all that, I have been myself interested to note that when China has gone, for example, to Australia to say, we should join hands, Australia has said, no thank you, right? And when they've gone to Canada, Canada looks to Europe. And so what I think we're seeing more, as opposed to a shift to China, I think our allies and partners are looking to each other. And so I think the issue is, where does the U.S. end up, after 4 years? I don't know. And again, things could change over the next 4 years in ways that are relatively more or less positive for our standing with our allies and partners. But I don't think the rest of the world, at least among the advanced market democracies, is looking to China as the replacement for the United States. I think Europe is looking, we need to be stronger. I was in Greece at the Delphi Economic Forum, and there were 2 panels of Chinese experts speaking, and they were all about, we're here, we're ready to partner with Europe against this, chaotic, United States. Again, the Europeans didn't seem to be jumping, at the opportunity. They really seemed to be saying, how do we strengthen ourselves, and how do we work with other like-minded partners? So I think China has work to do. I think because there's distrust of China because of COVID, because of the lack of transparency and the sort of economic coercive behavior that it displayed, because of its role in supporting Russia economically, in Ukraine, and because a lot of countries, again, are facing their own economic challenges from China. This isn't a uniquely U.S. issue. And so I think, again, that it's too early to say that somehow China is going to benefit very directly from this and the U.S. somehow is going to be supplanted.
So you touch upon these issues. So in your mind, what is China's ambition globally? What's their objectives? So how do the United States deal with this? So in response to China's ambition and strategies?
So I think under Xi Jinping, there are big ambitions, right? And there are people who disagree with this, but I think, he has ambitions certainly to be the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific, in the Asia-Pacific. I think, I think it begins with China's sovereignty claims, sort of the core issues of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. And then there are a number of other territorial disputes. I think Xi Jinping is committed to making progress on all of those so that when he does leave, whenever that happens, China as a geographic entity is going to look quite different from the way that it looks today. Much more expanded domain of influence and control. Again, I think it sees itself as the natural leader in the Asia-Pacific. It will have to deal with India and Japan and some others to get that, but I think that is an objective. And it wants the U.S. out. And I think it's made that quite clear in many statements. Asia is for Asians to govern. That doesn't include the United States. I think, dual circulation, speaking to issues I'm sure that are going to be discussed throughout the day. I do think Xi Jinping has introduced, a different notion from what came before in terms of the sense of, China being much more self-sufficient, right? Able to, innovate, manufacture, and consume largely within itself because it does have, in his mind, such a large economy, such large capabilities, continuing to export, continuing to have, the international, business community be dependent on China for parts of its supply chain, but fundamentally creating a very different relationship with the global economy, one in which it's protected from the sort of pressures of the global economy, but at the same time exerts enormous influence on it. So much more of a one-way, a sort of influence. And then I think, again, when I've already discussed this, sort of the areas where I think China would like to transform norms and ideals, in areas like human rights and others, I think shaping the geostrategic and political landscape in new ways through programs like the Belt and Road Initiative and through its behavior in international institutions. So I think de-dollarizing the global economy is another sort of desire, not in addition to, I would say, increasing the role of the Chinese currency in the global economy. I think actually it was a brilliant innovation by the Chinese, just I think really as a result of the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to say, look at the way the US weaponizes the dollar. And all countries should be able to use their own currencies. Before the narrative was largely China wants to increase the use of the renminbi, right? But then it became every country should be able to use its own currency, which is a lot more attractive to other countries to buy into that narrative than we should just all be trading with Chinese currency and investing with the Chinese currency. So I think that's another ambition, is to reduce the dominance of the dollar in the global economy. So I think it has a number of big ambitions, none of which actually coincides with U.S. interests, really, as they are currently situated. I mean, taking action on climate change and addressing global issues around health, I think those are shared interests for most normal U.S. administrations, and not necessarily this one.
Nice. So, I will ask the last question, and then open up. So, what would be the areas that the two sides can still collaborate today? It's a hard question.
This is actually the only really difficult question for me. Where can they cooperate? Shoot. Really having a hard time here. I guess
maybe that's
here's an area where we could. There are many areas where we could cooperate, and I think at the level of states, at the level of private actors, cooperation can certainly continue and should continue. And just for example, the areas that I just mentioned, right, climate and health. Cooperation in emerging economies. U.S. business and Chinese business. There are many areas that we could cooperate. I just don't think that this administration is going to be driven in that way because it doesn't see its responsibility like that on the global stage. So those things are kind of, not going to be present, I don't think. It would be good if we could cooperate. Here, an area where China has increasingly shown interest is in mediating global conflict. If the United States and China could find their way together, for example, in the Middle East. Obviously, we've tried with China in the Russia-Ukraine conference. I would say they have not been at all helpful in this space. So I think that may be an area where, we just saw the, India-Pakistan conflict where China kind of dipped its toe in and then, pulled it back out, and the U.S. went in and mediated it. But it's an area where certainly our interest in not having India and Pakistan, two nuclear powers, end up, having that conflict expand, in any way, is in both our interests. So there are some areas, I think, where we might find common cause. Yeah.
Okay, great. So now I'm going to have one question. Okay.
Hey, thanks,
Seriously,
Liz.
Arthur?
That was terrific.
Okay. Uh-huh.
So clearly one of the challenges of defining the U.S.-China relationship is that you have all of these strategic rivalry and pretty substantial areas of non-overlapping or directly conflicting interest that have to be dealt with. But you also have a degree of economic interdependence that is basically unprecedented for a political relationship of that type. It bears no relationship to what we had with the Soviet Union. Economic interdependence is actually much more than it was with Japan in the 1980s because of the level of U.S. investment there. So I'd be curious about your thoughts about, essentially the question is, there seems to be an agreement that you need to recalibrate that independence and pull it apart. Every time you come up against decoupling, people realize that it's basically impossible. That's even what Scott Bessent said the other day, and you can't do it. And so I'd be curious about your thoughts about, rather than a binary, what is the type and amount of decoupling that is both achievable and desirable, and what kinds of costs should we be willing to bear to do that, because none of that is going to come for free?
So I think from the perspective of the U.S., it begins with, any technology sharing that could be used by the Chinese to undermine our national security. So I think that's where it starts. From that point, I would say, again, going back to the sort of supply chain argument, ensuring that when it comes to national, economic, and human security, that we have multiple sort of supply chains, resilient supply chains, we're not overly dependent on China for any one thing. I think you see that now with the big push on critical minerals and rare earth elements in the U.S. government. And I think that's the right thing to do. I think we do need to diversify because we do also know that China is willing to use its economic leverage in coercive ways. We've seen it play out against our companies. We've seen it play out in significant ways against other countries. And so we can't depend on China. So we need to protect ourselves, I think. Beyond that, I am not in favor of decoupling. And I think the word, is derisking. That's the word that we used in the Biden administration. I am very happy to have Nike and Starbucks and many other U.S. brand companies selling in China. I'm very happy to have Chinese companies selling here, not looking to limit, Shein and others. So I think when it comes to consumer goods and other things, I don't have any problem with it. There is, of course, a difficulty in defining that list of critical technologies. I'm not going to just make it, because we were not able to do that in the Biden administration. I'm sure the Trump administration is not going to do that effectively. I think it's a very slippery slope. And so really taking the time to think through what is critical and what is not. Can you design a chip that cannot be used for hypersonic missiles but can be used for gaming, right? That to me is the objective, right? That's the objective. But it's not going to be perfect. And also a willingness, I think, to recognize if we've gone too far, to pull back. I think that's very difficult for the U.S. government to do. And but I think that's a really important element to this because, sometimes in that zeal to address these big issues, you're going to swing too wide. So can you calibrate back, I think is really important. I will say that, when I was at the Commerce Department, we had many, many meetings with CEOs, and over the time that I was there was definitely a greater appreciation for, A, China as a strategic challenge, and B, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the parallel with the China-Taiwan crisis. And even if CEOs were not immediately concerned about it, a lot of their boards were. And so you really began to hear a difference in, we need to de-risk, right? Without the US government trying to say, you need to do this, I think a lot of American CEOs began to take on board the notion that, we are much more interdependent with China than we ever were with Russia, even, and we can't afford to take that kind of hit, so we need to be taking action now, because that threat of geopolitical, geostrategic, insecurity is too great for us. So I think there's some natural element of that that's happening. And let's face it, the environment for multinationals in China has been more difficult in the past several years for a lot of them, despite all of the talk by the Chinese government about being open to foreign investment. We welcome you, we welcome you. When we were there, when I was there with Secretary Raimondo, they were all like, we've had these roundtables with, your US companies. We've told them we want you to reinvest here. We welcome foreign investment. And the Secretary's response was, let's see the changes on the ground, because you're not going to get that foreign direct investment back unless you actually make changes on the ground. So I think there's a natural de-risking that's taking place by some US companies, but also it's going to have to be, I'd rather have us take the time and get it right as much as we possibly can than kind of overshoot and then try to claw back, which I think is much more difficult.
What about Chinese manufacturing investment in the United States?
I mean, President Trump has said at one point that he welcomes it. And, I think a really interesting case would be, for example, like CATL, right? And cattle, should we have them do batteries, right? They had a couple of opportunities. I don't actually know where those projects stand right now. I think for my mind, I'd welcome thinking about it the way that the Chinese did back in the late 80s and early 1990s, which is let's welcome the foreign investment in areas where we are not as advanced as our competitors, but use that time to learn, not to steal, of course, but to learn, and then to develop our own domestic industry. So make sure that at the same time as we're welcoming, that we are thinking about how do we not only develop, but in fact try to leapfrog. So I see that as an area that I would be willing to take that risk and that gamble. I don't know whether the government will be.
Hi, I'm Deborah Brodigan from Johns Hopkins University, and we're here at Stanford University. Both universities have been deeply engaged with China. About 2 weeks ago, I got an email from the Export Control Board at our university. I was getting IRB approval for a grant from the Gates Foundation, and the Export Control Board asked me, so would you mind, before you have any interview or any engagement with someone from China, give us a list so that we can approve it for you? And this is, of course, impossible. Here, I would have to give them a list of everybody. So there is, and then to jump up to the bigger issue, this the climate of concern, the fear about moving back to the Justice Department's China initiative. Universities are really afraid about this. And how is this going to affect the interaction that we've had with our Chinese partners overseas and all of that engagement, the technology transfer, the learning? How is this affecting you? How do you think this is going to affect the United States and our relationship?
Yeah, so this is a huge and really important issue. Again, here I'm also in favor of welcoming in, but trying to think about how do we ensure that we're not having 1,000 PLA officers disguised as researchers and postdocs placed into our universities, and then we have to ship them back. So let's try through our immigration screening at the outset to get it right. But one of my greatest fears, frankly, is the low number of American students studying in China today. I think this is disastrous for the United States, for our understanding of China, for our future understanding of China. Same with journalists. I think we really suffer by not having Americans in China, and honestly, the withdrawal of many American expat business people. That community has shrunk significantly over the past, I would say, 5 years or so. So I think it's a huge problem. I am not a fan of the China Initiative, and again, I think the vast majority of Chinese students and researchers are here to learn and to develop their skills. I hope most of them stay. I think it's a huge source of our great scientific talent in particular. But we also just need to be careful. I don't think there's any denying that there have been some very serious cases of, intellectual property theft and scientific espionage. And so we do need to be concerned about. I'm concerned about university campuses where some Chinese students are reporting on their fellow Chinese students. All those things are real. I think that the issue is how do we address them in a measured, tempered way that gets at 90% of the problem and doesn't make a new, 90% problem of not having Chinese students come here, because the political climate is so terrible. So I don't want to ignore the actual challenges that are being faced, and that the Chinese government is responsible for. I think that would be foolish on our part. At the same time, I am extremely concerned that we not overreact. I think that, every week the South China Morning Post, has a profile of a Chinese scientist who's been here for 30 or 40 years, who's absolutely top in, I would say, his or her field, but I don't think I've ever seen a picture of a woman. So we'll just say his field, going back to China. And I understand it, given the climate here. So, I am quite concerned. I think it's going to be very difficult to make this case in this particular administration. That being said, it is entirely possible that President Trump, who knows what he's going to do, right? And so I don't ever want to take off the table the possibility that you could have a radical shift or opening with China under President Trump. I think there are many different views in his administration, and I know there's skepticism. I see it in the back of the room, but I'm telling you, if you really listen to some of the stuff he says, and I certainly don't want to get into the space of Taiwan and a deal with that would deal with Taiwan, but I think there's a little bit of all bets are off when it comes to him.
Hello.
Leo, seriously? You can come talk to me in my office anytime.
Well, but I never get to ask this question, and I have the inkling that this room may have appetite for contemplating a certain doomsday scenario. I think many of us are painfully aware of two harsh realities. One is that China is at a confluence of crises, internal crises, and two, things are only going to get better through a good wrecking crisis. And so I wonder, in that scenario of doomsday, are you aware, being on the inside of the American government and being in the circle, how will the U.S. respond to a scenario whereby the Communist Party falls apart, the economy gets into a huge crisis, even the country may be on the verge of disintegrating? Has the U.S. government ever contemplated or come up with a plan for such emergency scenario?
I can say that I have never seen such a plan. That's what I can answer with, honestly. I've never seen such a plan. I think as much as I saw in the administration, I think there was a lot of discussion beginning last summer at the end of the Biden administration, about China's slowing economy and its impact on its foreign policy and the sort of retrenchment a little bit on the global stage. It wasn't something that I subscribed to, actually, but I think that narrative developed. But I think that kind of doomsday scenario that you are talking about, generally, I think has been, people like Gordon Chang and some others that have written about this, like it's going to collapse in, what was it, 2000, then it was going to collapse in 2010, then probably there'll be a new one, 2001, I don't know, but I think not to minimize the possibility of that, but I don't think that is a central understanding of where China is today. I think it's much more about, the debate is much more about the economy is in deep trouble, fundamentally flawed, and it's going to grind to a halt at some point. When exactly, we don't know, versus this economy is on steroids, and it is the most competitive thing out there, and we really need to up our game. I haven't seen in a long time that the Chinese economy is going to collapse, and you could end up with political chaos, etc.
So maybe I'll collect two questions and you answer at the same time. So
I think we're over time,
you
right?
and Matt, yeah.
Just one. He doesn't have a question.
Yeah, just really quickly. I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts about how much Xi Jinping specifically is a determining factor of current tensions between the U.S. and China, since I know you already mentioned his initiatives for how to transform the international order, but since given your timeline for the U.S.-China adversarial relationship very much aligns with Xi's presidency, how much do you think in like a post-Xi world that U.S.-China relationship will transform?
I mean, it depends on who comes after Xi Jinping, right? But I am somebody who believes that leaders matter a lot. And, this is a source of debate, as all of the China political science types in this room will know within the field about, the extent to which this is system-driven or whether it's personality-driven. But I like to look back, and I think it's an advantage of being a comparativist as opposed to somebody who just looks at U.S. policy toward China. Look back to 2009, 10, and 11, and I think inside China you saw a very different China than the one you saw after Xi Jinping, and you see it very clearly in terms of all the laws and regulations that his administration put in place. So, for my money, we should always hold open the possibility of pretty significant economic and political change in China, irrespective of the fact that it has, a CCP. There are also, 15, 20 other small political parties. I mean, the potential to my mind is always there. So that's why I think also continuing to engage with China, continuing to maintain open channels of communication, continuing to have people going back and forth is 100% essential.
All right, so for the interest of time, I wish I could have you speaking the whole day.
I'm sure nobody else wishes that, but anyway, thank you.
Let's give a quick round of applause.
Thanks.
Fantastic.